Okay, guys, I was saying to Gavin on Sunday that this sort of topic of giving to the poor has come up before. So it is something that we have touched on before, but I thought I would incorporate it just so that you've got some material for assignments if you need. So we're going to be looking at these 7 chapters: stewardship, reaching your full potential and inheritance, stewardship of giving, Jesus and giving, responsibilities to ministries and giving to the poor. I'm going to step on, and there we go, finally. Okay, stewardship was originally made up of the tasks of a domestic steward from stig, which means house or hall, and ward, which means ward, guard, or guardian. Stewardship in the beginning referred to the household servant's duties for bringing food and drink to the castle's dining hall. Stewardship responsibilities were eventually expanded to include domestic service and management needs of the entire household. But stewardship now is generally recognized as the acceptance or assignment of responsibility to shepherd and safeguard the values, or the valuables, of others. Now, this is from the notes, responsibility. God gives us things richly to enjoy. Nothing is really ours. Nothing belongs to us. God owns everything. We're responsible for how we treat it, what we do with it. While we complain about our rights here on earth, the Bible constantly reminds us about our responsibilities. Owners have rights. Stewards have responsibilities. Now, a steward is one who manages the possessions of another. We're all stewards of the resources, abilities, and opportunities that God has entrusted to our care. And one day, each one of us will be called to give an account for how we have managed what the Master has given us. This is the maxim taught by the parable of the talents. Like the servants in the parable of the talents, we will be called to give an account of how we have administered everything we have been given, including our time, money, abilities, information, wisdom, relationships, and authority. Now, I want to look at the fact that we actually are made by God and we actually belong to Him. And when we understand that, then life makes sense. It's vital to remember that we're not our own, that we are God's. It says in Isaiah 43:1, I have called you by name, you are mine. So that means everything, our talents, our possessions, money, time, everything belongs to God. We're just responsible for managing them. But in God's eyes, we ourselves are more valuable than all the riches in the world. That's why Jesus said, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world? It loses his soul. Because to God, that's of much more worth than the things that He just spoke into being, because He bought us with His own blood. In Genesis 26, we see that when God made Adam, he made, well, actually it says He made man in His image. In the image of God, He created them male and female. So it's not just Adam. Male and female have been created in the image of God. And when Jesus was questioned by the Pharisees, the Herodians, as to whether they should pay taxes or not, Jesus actually asked them for a Roman coin. And it says here, Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought Him a denarius. He asked them, whose image is this? And whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then He said, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left Him and went away. So Caesar's image was on the coin, but God's image is on us. We are made in His image, so we belong to Him. And in Romans 14, Paul says this, for none of us lives for ourselves alone. None of us dies for ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. Now, God knows that we belong to Him, but that reality needs to sort of dawn on us. In Isaiah 44:1-5, there's a nice passage of scripture. It says, Now listen, Jacob, my servant Israel, whom I have chosen. This is what the Lord says, he who made you, he who formed you in the womb, and who will help you. Do not be afraid, Jacob, my servant, Jeshurun, whom I have chosen, for I will pour water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour out my spirit on your offspring and my blessing on your descendants. They will spring up like grass in a meadow, like poplar trees by flowing streams. Some will say, I belong to the Lord. Others will call themselves by the name of Jacob. Still others will write on their hand, the Lord's, and will take the name Israel. Now, just to sort of like give you a little bit of a thing to relate to as to what this whole thing of stewardship's all about. When I, about 17 years ago, was on my way to the UK, I was waiting for a flight in Dubai, and walking around the airport, there were two cars that were being raffled. I can't remember what the other one was. Oh, yeah, it was a Maserati, that's right. And there was a Ferrari. And looking at it, no, you sort of like think what it would be like to actually drive a car like that. Not that anybody can really afford something like that unless you're one of these chaps who sort of like preach the prosperity message. Now, if someone let you look after their Ferrari for 3 months while they went overseas and they asked you to take it for a drive every day, just think about how you would handle it. If your answer is that you would take extra special care of it, and I asked you why, you probably would say it's a very expensive car, it didn't belong to you, and that you were just looking after it. Now, most of us know Ziggy, and I'm not too sure if Dougie knows him, but I think the rest of us do. And he's not somebody who would idolize a car. And this car here is the car he drives at the moment. And I've seen the two cars that he had prior to this. And he always used to keep them spotless. I remember the very first car he had was one of these old shaped Mercedes. And also, you know, absolutely meticulous. So what he's been given is actually being given to him by the Lord. Funnily enough, I actually remember that when he was given the second car, I think it was a Renault, if I'm not mistaken, the guy who was his biggest supporter actually stopped supporting him because he had a new car. And I mean, the car, he didn't even buy it. Somebody bought it for him, and they bought it for him on the proviso that he would actually give away his other car to some other person who had need. Now, Ziggy told me that the doorman at the Sheridan Hotel told him that his car is cleaner than the state president's car and the other dignitaries. And this is the answer that he gave to the doorman. He said that I use it to transport the King of Kings. Now, if you've got that kind of attitude to what you have, that it's not yours, that it's something that's been sort of like entrusted to you to look after, I think you'll be a lot more careful about it. And I mean, that's the way we should view even our bodies and everything that we own. An important element of stewardship is the idea of money and our bodies belonging to God. By recognizing that God is even God of our wealth, a good steward will always tithe so that there may be food in God's storehouse. Now, we're going to be doing tithing in 2 weeks' time, and I want us to have a little bit of input from everybody then, because I don't actually agree with the notes. So just if you haven't read it up on tithing, just make sure you read before then, because I'd like to have your input, because whoever wrote the notes doesn't agree with tithing. And I believe that everything in the Old Testament was really just a starting point. You haven't touched on the fact that the commandments that were given, they were reinforced again in the New Testament, except for the Sabbath day. And they were actually not only reinforced, you have to actually go over and beyond them. I mean, the requirements that God gives us actually, he doesn't say just don't commit adultery. He says, if you even look at a woman and lust after her, you're an adulterer. So I believe that the 10th is actually the bare minimum. It's a starting point. And to try and sort of minimize the idea of tithing just because some guys have sort of like gone overboard with the whole prosperity thing, I think is ridiculous. Because then you can sort of like decide what you're going to do. And, you know, just send your money here, there, and everywhere. And with that kind of thing, you're going to sort of like cripple the local churches. The idea of giving tithes goes back as far as the time of Abraham. It's a sign showing that we acknowledge God's lordship over even our wallets. But above all, it's a sign that says we love God more than our money. That we need to recognize that even if we need the 10% of our salary, we give it to the Lord because we trust that He is our provider. Hebrews 13:5 says, keep your lives free from the love of money. Be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And one of the things we'll look at tithing is something like what happened with Achan, that the Lord said when they went into the promised land, the very first city that they took, the city of Jericho, everything there was the sacred portion that belonged to God. And Achan and his whole family were struck down dead because Achan went and took some of the stuff and he hid it under his tent. So, just showing that, and the whole thing of the feast, the Feast of First Fruits, it was all about when you get something, before you even take anything for yourself, you actually give God His portion. God owes us nothing, not a thank you, not even an explanation. Job says this in Job 41, who has given to me? Well, Job doesn't say this, sorry, the Lord says this to Job. Who has given this to me that who has first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. Luke 17:7-10, Jesus says this, suppose one of you has a servant plowing or looking after the sheep. Will he say to the servant when he comes in from the field, come along now and sit down to eat? Won't he say, prepare my supper, get yourself ready and wait for me while I eat and drink? After that you may eat and drink. Will he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. Now that's the responsibility that we have as far as Christians is concerned. We're supposed to look after what God has entrusted to our care. And when we do that, we shouldn't expect a pat on the back. We should say, as the Lord says, we haven't gone over and beyond it. We've just simply done our duty. Now, there's 4 principles about stewardship. Just excuse me, I'm going to have a sip of my coffee. Principle of ownership. Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's, everything in it, the world and all who live in it. In the beginning of Genesis, God creates everything, puts Adam and Eve in the garden to work it and take care of it. It's clear that man was created to work and that the work is the stewardship of all the creation that God has given him. This is the fundamental principle of biblical stewardship. God owns everything. We are simply managers or administrators acting on his behalf. Therefore, stewardship expresses our obedience regarding the administration of everything God has placed under our control, which is all-encompassing. Stewardship is the commitment of oneself and possessions to God's service, recognizing that we do not have the right to control over our property or ourselves. Deuteronomy 8:17. My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. That's what some people say. But Deuteronomy 8:18, the very next verse said, remember the Lord your God, for he gives you the ability to produce wealth. So we may think, yeah, but I've worked hard for this. But our very breath, our health is in the Lord's hands. So while we have breath and while we have health, let's remember our responsibility as stewards, because we're not owners. And you'll find these principles in your notes as well. Obviously, I've got a little bit more laid out here. The principle of responsibility, although God gives us all things richly to enjoy, nothing is ours. We live in a world in which it's all about my rights, and we've got a Bill of Rights, and we've got human rights and all sorts of rights. Nothing really belongs to us. God owns everything. We're responsible for how we treat it and what we do with it. While we complain about our rights here on earth, the Bible constantly asks, what about your responsibilities? So you'll find that slaves in the Bible were slaves that had no rights. They were actually owned by the master. And basically, we can choose if we want to be slaves to sin or slaves of righteousness. But when we choose to be a slave of Christ, we belong to him. We are his. And our responsibility is to him. Owners have rights. Stewards have responsibilities. So we don't have rights. We are called God's stewards to manage that which belongs to God. While God has graciously entrusted us with the care, development, and the enjoyment of everything he owns as his stewards, we are responsible to manage his holdings well and according to his desires and purposes. Then there's the principle of accountability. A steward is one who manages the possessions of another. We are all stewards of the resources and abilities, opportunities that God has entrusted to our care. But one day he will call each one of us to give an account of how we've managed what he has given us. This is the maxim that is taught in the parable of the talents, and we'll look at that when we do tithing. Sorry, I need to just get back there. God has entrusted authority over creation to us, and we are not allowed to rule over it as we see fit. We are called to exercise our dominion under the watchful eye of the Creator, managing his creation in accord with the principles he has established. Like the servants in the parable of the talents, we will be called to give an account of how we've administered everything we've been given, including our time, money, abilities, information, wisdom, relationships, and authority. We will all give account to the rightful owner as to how we have managed these things. And then you get the principle of reward. And Colossians 3:23 and 24, it says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. So that's the way we should conduct our work. Sorry, my coffee's getting cold here. As working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. The Bible shows us in the parables of the kingdom that faithful stewards who do the master's will with the master's resources can be expected to be rewarded incompletely in this life, but fully in the next. And so, you know, it doesn't matter what our job is. I mean, if we look at Daniel, Daniel must have done his job amazingly to have been entrusted to third in the kingdom. And even when the king was tricked into making that rule that it ended up with Daniel being cast into the lion's den, I mean, he was very unhappy about it. So you can imagine how good this guy was as a servant to the king. And that's the way the Lord expects us to be to our employer. We should actually be people that are very employable. I know that I heard quite a while ago that they say in South Korea that business owners prefer hiring Christians because they're much better workers. I very much doubt that that applies in the West, because Christians often have a sense of entitlement in the West, and maybe it's because of the rubbish doctrine that they've been exposed to. Matthew 25:21, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. So that's what we should be looking forward to when we stand before the Lord. As Christians, we need to embrace this larger biblical view of stewardship that connects everything we do with what God is doing in the world. Now, reaching our full potential, this is just something from the notes. Obviously, there's that scripture that we looked at just now, and let me just read the whole thing. He did it so that you will never think that it was your own strength and energy that made you wealthy. Always remember that it is the Lord your God who gives you power to become rich. And he does it to fulfill the covenant he made with your ancestors. We can only reach our full potential when we get this revelation. We own nothing. God owns everything. He blesses us with natural abilities to get things done and rewards us for our faithfulness. Everything we have or will have belongs to him, and therefore we are his stewards. Our lives, our families, our businesses, our ministries, our finances, everything belongs to him. Jesus said in Luke 16, verse 10 to 15, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with very much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. If you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And that makes it quite clear that God doesn't consider money and the things that we consider to be so great as something very important. If you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? So what we have is not our own. We are stewards, and one day we will be held to account on how good we have been as stewards. And then God will hopefully entrust us with property of our own and give us true responsibility over things that belong to us. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. The Pharisees who loved money heard this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in the sight of God. So we value money highly, but God actually detests money because people actually make a god of it. Once again, this is from the notes and inheritance, the next chapter. Today, we live in a world where a lot of people have an attitude of entitlement. They feel that they're entitled to earn big salaries with minimum effort, entitled to free education, entitled just goes on. The entitlement mentality says it's my right, therefore I demand. There's no accountability or responsibility with entitlement. Proverbs 13, 4 and 22, lazy people want much but get little. Those who work hard will prosper and be satisfied. Good people leave an inheritance to their grandchildren, but the sinner's wealth passes to the godly. Now, this entitlement is something that we see very much in our own country. Entitlement is the belief that one is inherently deserving of privileges or special treatment. And it's the complete opposite of gratitude. God has called us to have an attitude of gratitude, to be thankful. But if you've got a sense of entitlement, you'll never be thankful, because no matter what you're given, you think that it's, your due. And this kind of like puts it in a nutshell. I found this quite good, this little cartoon here. This one hippie says to his hippie girlfriend, I'll run over and pick up both our welfare checks, then drop by the university to see what's holding up our federal education grants. Meanwhile, you go to the free clinic for a pregnancy test, and if it's positive, fill out the necessary papers for assistance and baby bonus. Oh, and pick up my free glasses. And then we will meet at the federal building at noon for a mass picketing of the stinking establishment. So it's kind of like the people that we've bred in this world we're living in today. They've got a handout and they're grabbing from here, there, and everywhere. Don't want to work for what they have, and then they want to protest about everything. There's another very good little cartoon here where everybody's got complaints, but nobody's got a word of thanks. If the same spirit of entitlement and ingratitude that characterizes our culture characterizes us, what do we have to offer? Frank A. Clark says this: if a fella isn't thankful for what he's got, he isn't likely to be thankful for what he's going to get. Henry Frederick Amiel says, thankfulness is the beginning of gratitude. Gratitude is the completion of thankfulness. Thankfulness may consist merely of words. Gratitude is shown in acts. Entitlement is, according to Emmons, a chosen attitude. We must be willing to recognize and acknowledge that we are the recipients of an unearned benefit. This is especially rare among middle-class high school and college students who have grown up in a world that's revolved around them, one that allows them to build a platform via social media without displaying value, one that repeatedly communicates they are awesome and deserve trophies for just playing. This world actually cultivates a sense of entitlement. Students feel they deserve any good they've received. It is in fact contrary to the growth of the spirit of gratitude. Entitlement is virtually the opposite of gratitude. As I feel more entitled, my gratitude shrinks. Research indicates that gratitude is not merely a positive emotion. It can improve your health if cultivated. Research also indicates that students must give up a victim mentality and overcome a sense of entitlement and deservedness. Think for a moment, when someone feels entitled to something, there's no need for gratitude. I don't need to thank someone. I deserve the gift. In fact, these people are lucky to have me around. I'm amazing. Gratitude has to do with our attitude, something that's in our heart. Thanksgiving is the expression of our gratitude. This involves our mouth and our tongue. And Gertrude Stein says silent gratitude isn't very much to anyone. And it's like confession. The Bible says, come to the Lord, bring words. The Lord actually wants to hear. It's no good saying, oh, well, God knows my heart, he knows. It's like a guy who never tells his wife he loves her. He said, well, 40 years ago when we got married, I told you I loved you. Why do I need to keep repeating it? William Arthur Ward says, feeling gratitude is not expressing it is like wrapping a present and not giving it. Mike Murdock, some of you might know him. I've seen him on TBN. Quite a while ago, I heard him say this. He put 120 young people through Bible college, and after 90 days, he never heard from them again after paying for them to go through Bible college. 2 Timothy 3:1-5, in the last days, men will be ungrateful. Romans 1:21, they did not give thanks to God. We need not only to have an attitude of gratitude, we need to express it. It's impossible to feel grateful and depressed at the same time, Naomi Williams says. You remember how when the 10 lepers were healed, that only one of them came back to the Lord and thanked him. And the Lord said, weren't there 10 of you? And this guy was a Samaritan. And Jesus says, yeah, we're not all 10 cleansed. We are the other 9. Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Then he said, rise, go. Your faith has made you well. You sometimes wonder what happened to the other 9, whether their healing was something that stayed and was complete, because just this one Samaritan came back and actually thanked the Lord. And that's because people just in general are not grateful and are not thankful. They take so much for granted. And even in adverse circumstances, you look at Paul and Silas. They'd been beaten, they'd been flogged, they'd been put in stocks, and in the middle of the night, they're praising the Lord. And through that, they're able to lead the jailer and his whole family to the Lord. And Paul in prison writes the letter to the Philippians and says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving. And so often we're so caught up with what we want from the Lord that we bring in our next request and we're not thanking him for what he's already done. Paul says, 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rocks. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. And this is the guy who says, rejoice in the Lord always. Do everything without grumbling and arguing, he says. Then you will shine among them like stars. Why? Because we're living in a crooked and a warped generation. In Numbers, we see how ungrateful the Israelites were, and it was for this reason that God actually brought judgment upon them. He says, how long shall this wicked generation grumble against me? I've heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they grumble against me. But rather in Colossians 3, it says here that we must give thanks to the Lord. That's part of what we should be doing. It says in Colossians 2, overflowing with thankfulness. Now, responsibilities to the ministries is the next chapter. I'm not going to do much on this. There's a whole lot that one could say about this, but I'm grateful that we as a church give about 20% of our income, or that's what it used to be. It might be, a little less or a little more. I'm not too sure. But we believe that one should tithe. So we more than tithe. We actually double tithe into missions, supporting missionaries. And Paul writes to the Philippians, stating to them that they were the only church at this particular point in time that was supporting him. He says, yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving, except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. So very important. Okay, the next chapter, and I think this is the last one, giving to the poor. Mother Teresa, who we all know, sort of devoted her whole life to living amongst the poor and helping them, said, if you judge people, you have no time to love them. People are often unreasonable and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you're honest, people may cheat you. Be honest anyway. If you find happiness, people may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today may be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Give the world the best you have, and it may never be enough. Give your best anyway. For you see, in the end, it's between you and God. It was never between you and them. And that's somebody who understands what stewardship is. In this world, if this world were shrunk to the size of a village of 100 people, what would it look like? Of the wealth of this village, this is just for those of us who sometimes think that we're poor. Of the wealth of this village, 6 people own 59%. 74 of these people own 39%. 20 people share the remaining 2%. I'll show you a diagram with that on just now. Of the energy of this village, 20 people consume 80%. 80 people share the remaining 20%. 20 are undernourished. 1 is dying of starvation, and 15 are overweight. 20 have no clean, safe water to drink. 56 have access to sanitation. 15 adults are illiterate. 1 has a university degree, and 7 have computers. Now, if you look at those stats there, ask yourself, are you part of the majority or a part of the minority? And there's that diagram. You can see there, 6 of the people, if the 6 billion, 7 billion people of the world were condensed and we had 100 people that represented them, 6 of those people own 59% of the wealth, and all 6 of them come from the USA. 74 own 39%, and 20 of them own that little tail there of the pig. If you do not live in fear of death by bombardment, armed attack, landmines, or of rape or kidnapping by armed groups, then you are more fortunate than 20 who do. If you can speak and act according to your faith and your conscience without harassment, imprisonment, torture, or death, then you are more fortunate than 48 who cannot. If you have money in the bank, money in your wallet, and spare change somewhere around the house, then you are among the richest 8. And just some scriptures just to show the importance of giving to the poor and our responsibility. Proverbs 19:17, he who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward him for what he has done. So this junk that you've seen in our notes of a poverty spirit and all the rest is a lot of nonsense. The Lord actually puts himself in the place of the poor in the scripture. It says when you're giving to the poor, you're giving to him. Proverbs 21:13, if a man shuts his ears to the cry of the poor, he too will cry out and not be answered. Proverbs 14:31, he who oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. This is also one of the chapters, Jesus and giving to the poor. We'll get to that just now. I just want to read one or two more verses. Proverbs 31:8-9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. You must remember in certain countries, like especially these Muslim countries, if you're a Christian, you don't get a good job. They don't pay you the same as everybody else. You don't get access to university. You're discriminated against because you're a Christian. Ezekiel 16:49, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. And one of the things that they were told to do in the Old Testament is that they were supposed to have a special tithe every 3rd year. So this is not just the monthly tithe that they had to pay or whatever. It says here in Deuteronomy 6, when you have finished setting aside 1/10 of all your produce in the 3rd year, the year of tithe, you shall give it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow, so that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. Then say to the Lord your God, I have removed from my house the sacred portion. And there you see, once again, this whole idea of the sacred portion that we see with Achan, that it belongs to the Lord. I have given it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all you have commanded. I have not turned aside from your commands, nor have I forgotten any of them. In the law, you find that God made provisions for the poor to be taken care of. They were told that they weren't to reap the corners, the edges of the field. It says here in Leviticus 19, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of the harvest. If something falls down, leave it for the poor. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. At the end of every 7th year, you had to cancel debts. Deuteronomy 15, this is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel any loan they have made to a fellow Israelite. They shall not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for cancelling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your fellow Israelite owes you. However, there need be no poor among you. Now, this is a very interesting scripture because just this last week, somebody said, yeah, I know, but Jesus said you'll always have the poor with you. You know why Jesus said that? Is because people don't live according to his word. Because here he says, however, there need be no poor among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you, but the condition, if only you fully obey the Lord your God. and are careful to follow all these commands I'm giving you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised, and you will lend to many nations, but you will borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in the towns, in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God has given you, don't be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather be open-handed and freely lend to them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this thought in your heart, this wicked thought. The 7th year for cancelling debts is near, so that you do not show ill towards the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. So, in other words, if somebody needs something and it's like the 6th year, and you think, oh, if I go and lend this guy money, next year I'm not going to get my money back because it's the year for cancelling debts. Oh, there's no? Can you hear me? It must be the Zoom.
I can hear you.
Oh, no, Gavin can hear. It must be your computer. Sorry about that. Thanks, Gav. For some reason, Bev couldn't hear, and she thought that the sound had gone off. Okay, so it actually says that that's actually an evil thought, a wicked thought, to actually think, hey, next year's the year for cancelling debts, so I'm not going to lend you anything. Okay, so that you do not show ill toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them, and do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and everything you put your hand to. And notice what it says here, there will always be poor people in the land. So it says there doesn't need to be poor people, but God's saying there will always be poor. And why? Because people don't obey God and do what he says. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. Then further than this, if somebody actually owned property and they were in such a position that they ended up having to sell it, in the year of Jubilee, it would return to them. So when you actually bought property or were given property in settlement of debt, you would only really be paying for however many years were until the Jubilee, because in the year of Jubilee, it goes back to the person who owns it. So you never ever, the family never ever loses their property. It says here, I'm just going to read the underlined section, but if they do not acquire the means to repay what was sold, it will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee and they can go back to their property. Then the slaves were also freed in the 7th year. If any of your people, it says in Deuteronomy 15, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year, you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. But if your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you because he loves you and your family and is well off with you, then take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door, and he will become your servant for life. And that's how you actually became a bond servant. Do the same for your female servant. Do not consider it a hardship to set your servant free, because their service to you these 6 years has been worth twice as much as that of a hired hand. And the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. So over and over, the Lord had ways of taking care for the poor. So God made provision for his covenant people in the Old Testament, that they shouldn't have to endure continual poverty. Coming to the New Testament, we find that in Luke 16, it mentions 2 rich men, Abraham, and the other man is not mentioned, but he is in hell. Abraham is in paradise, Abraham's bosom, and there's a great gulf that separates him from this other rich man. He's in hell. And only one thing is mentioned about the second man's life, and that is that he neglected the poor man at his gate. And that should give us something to sort of like think about. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried in hell, where he was in torment. He looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. They called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. He is now comforted here, and you are in agony. And beside all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." So far from us sort of like being concerned about, the poor, we should be more concerned about the rich and make sure that they realize their responsibility and their accountability before God, because to whom much is given, much will be required. The danger of the prosperity message that sort of like has been a problem for the last 4 decades is that godliness was seen as a means to become rich, and the poor were despised. And both of those passages of scripture, make it quite clear that this is not how God views them. I'm only going to read this one in Timothy. People of corrupt mind who've been robbed of the truth, who think that godliness is a means to financial gain. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and to many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Somebody like George Muller used to use whatever he had for the needs that he had, and anything that was left over, he gave it to other ministries that were in need. For the love of money is the root of all kind of evil. People eager for money have wandered off from the faith, pierced themselves with many griefs. And then he gives this charge to Timothy: "But you, men of God, flee all of this. Through righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness." And it goes on to say here, in the sight of God, who gives life to everything, and of Jesus Christ, I charge you to keep this command. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. And we've seen this with these rich ministers and all the rest, is the arrogance. Put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. And you wonder how many guys are going to be serving their gardeners one day. We have no obligation to those who are too lazy to work. And I think that this is where we need to realize that there is balance. In 2 Thessalonians 3, Paul says this: "In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we command you, brothers and sisters, to keep away from every believer who is idle and disruptive and does not live according to the teaching you received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. We did this not because we do not have a right to such help, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you to imitate. Or even when we were with you, we gave you this rule: the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. We hear that some among you are idle and disruptive. They are not busy. They are busybodies. Such people we command and urge in Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the food they eat. As for you, brothers and sisters, never tire of doing what is good. Now, if we look at Paul in Acts chapter 20, he says, you yourselves know that these hands of mine have supplied my own needs. And this is why he was able to say in that previous portion that he never used his right. He had a right to expect people that he taught and people that he ministered to supply his needs. But he says he never exercised that right because he decided he would be a tent maker and he'd supply his own needs. In everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus himself. It is more blessed to give than to receive. So he says he not only supplied his own needs, but the needs of his companions. If we look at the early church, it says, be careful that you're not always, this is what I'm saying. Sorry, we'll look at the early church. Be careful that you're not always looking for an excuse to get out of helping someone in need, because you will always find one. In Acts chapter 2, verse 42 to 47, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in temple courts. They broke bread in their homes, ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying favor with all the people, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. This is the way the Lord worked in the early church, so that there were no needs amongst them, that people sold property and possessions and shared what they had. I want to close with this. It's something that I have shared a couple of years ago in the church, so some of you may remember it. But it's sort of like, is a good thing to sort of like examine ourselves and to see whether we fit into this category that these village of fools do. Once there was a very poor village in the midst of a desolate and barren land. The inhabitants were half starved, for they could never grow any food in the rocky soil that surrounded their village. Evening, a wealthy nobleman passed through the village. As the hour had grown late, he decided to stay the night. He called out to the first person he saw, "My good man, could you show me the way to the inn?" "In the villager asked, "We have no inn. We've never had much use for one here, but won't you come and stay at my house?" The nobleman accepted the humble invitation. When the other villagers heard about the stranger who was to spend the night there, they quickly gathered together the best they had and prepared a feast for him. The nobleman was so impressed with their hospitality and so moved by their poverty that he vowed to help them. A few months later, a large freight wagon drawn by a team of horses arrived in the village. It was loaded down with grain, dried fruit, salted meat, and cheese. Soon another wagon came carrying bolts of warm, sturdy cloth for garments and wood, bricks, straw for repairing the shacks and hovels that the people called home. The people of the village received these gifts with great joy, realizing that their visitor had become their benefactor. The more learned among them sat down at once and wrote very long thank you letters. Then they held a town meeting and deliberated at great length about erecting a statue of their benefactor, if only they could afford to do it. As the weeks, months, and years passed, the wagon loads continued to come regularly. After a time, the villagers began to take their benefactor for granted. The once regular letters of gratitude became an annual formality, a disagreeable duty, and soon the people dispensed with the letters altogether. Many years later, the nobleman, who had by now become even wealthier, was traveling through that part of the world. He decided to stop and visit his village. As he neared the place, he was pleased to see the sturdy houses with thatch roofs he was pleased to see sturdy houses with thatched roofs where before flimsy shacks had stood. But the surrounding fields looked as if they had lain fallow for years. The villagers, he noticed, had grown fat, and he saw that most of them were sitting idly in the middle of the day. Even through an open window, he saw a few women sewing dresses from the latest shipment of cloth. He overheard one of them complaining, "This miserable cloth, why couldn't we be sent some ready-sewn clothes?" The nobleman approached a dour-faced young man who was coming towards him and asked, "My good fellow, do you know where I might find lodging for the night?" The young man shrugged. "Why don't you ask someone else?" he retorted. "I'm too busy. I'm the only one around these parts who works." "What sort of work do you do?" asked the nobleman. The young man shrugged again in disgust. "I'm the town miller. Every so often we get a huge cartload of grain, and I'm the one who gets stuck with the bothersome task of grinding it into flour." He hurried off without another glance. Then the nobleman searched and found the small house where he had first received shelter so long ago. He knocked and a familiar face appeared. It was the son of the villager who had first given him lodging. "I've travelled far and I'm weary," he explained. "May I spend the night with your family?" "We don't appreciate strangers in this part," came the gruff reply. "But if you really must stay, there's an inn down the road." Incensed, the nobleman turned and left the village. He immediately cancelled all further deliveries of food and supplies. Then the villagers, who by now had forgotten how to farm and how to work, found themselves in a worse condition than before. Those villagers acted foolishly. They had forgotten their benefactor and had neglected to give him thanks. They had taken his gifts for granted and even despised some of them because of the inconvenience of putting them to use. Worst of all, they had not recognized their benefactor when he came to them, and they had treated him badly. Many people today are like those foolish villagers. They forget their divine benefactor who daily supplies their most basic needs. Instead of grumbling like the woman of the village who were too lazy to sew and the miller who despised his trade, they should be grateful. Let's not be fools this Thanksgiving, even with all the things in our lives, our country, our world that could be better. Let's remember to give thanks to the one to whom we owe all that we are, all that we have, and all that we ever hope to be and have. Let us always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Ephesians 5:20.